There's no doubt that Britain has produced her fair share of world-class conductors over the years, and that mantle continues to well and truly brightly shine through the extraordinary talents of my guest today, Nicholas Collon. I say extraordinary, but also daring, because Nicholas is the founder and principal conductor of the Aurora Orchestra. Well, perhaps nothing too unusual there, you might say, but when you see a group of musicians performing the likes of a Beethoven symphony, standing up, and each member playing the whole score by memory, well, that is astonishing. And it somehow morphs the listening skills of the audience and musicians in a subtly different way. But why? We're used to seeing classical and contemporary soloists and rock, folk, jazz, and many more musicians perform without looking at the dots, but not whole orchestras. So all I can say is, let's get listening. Hi, Nick. May I call you Nick?
Please, only my mother calls me Nicholas, so I'd love to be Nick. Yeah.
When she's angry?
Yeah, no, in all occasions, actually, yeah.
Well, I'm looking at your wonderful bookcase behind you there, and I'm assuming that's full of music scores?
It is music scores, books about music. Yeah, I love it. I mean, it's a conductor's sort of fetish, isn't it? Collecting music scores.
It is. So you don't use an iPad or whatever for reading your scores, do you?
No, I don't at all. And actually, as much as I value that idea going forward, there is something so gorgeously wonderful and tactile about the printed score. I know I will never get rid of that. I can imagine a world. It was funny, in fact, you were talking about memorization. That's exactly what we've done. We've got rid of the tactile score sitting in front of us. So I've just contradicted myself. But you know what I mean.
I do. And I suppose it's more also, well, I know in my own case, I'm a great scribbler on the music, and it's quite interesting looking back, you know, from 20 years ago, even 30 years ago, of some of the things I may have written in the music. It could be, you know, from a percussionist point of view, sticking, you know, right hand, left hand, or various musical thoughts, or the setups of the instruments and things like that, and how they've changed over the years. Is that something that you've done with your scores, and, you know, writing little ideas or things like that?
Conductors really vary in what they write into their scores, and there's whole different trains of thoughts on it. You'll see some, I mean, if you go back and look at William Mengelberg's scores of Mahler, so this would be very beginning of the 20th century, they are littered with instructions to the point where you can't actually see the notes. And then you get some conductors, one of my great teachers, Mark Elder, he used to say to me, you know, stop putting things in your scores. They're just what we called, I can't remember what he called it, something like stupid markings, you know. And that's because lots of conductors, you put a little ring around a horn entry when it comes in order to say horn entry. Well, it says horn entry anyway. Why are you putting that? You know, it's just a sort of, it's some kind of safety net for you as a conductor. And I have to say, when I look back at scores that I marked up 10 years ago and I've not touched since, it's a little bit like hearing your voice, you know, that horrible feeling of shame at what you used to do, you know, ideas about this or that analogy or metaphor, and you think, oh God, what was I thinking 10 years ago? And you're completely different now. So I don't actually like it very much.
Well, I don't know. I remember working with the wonderful Polish conductor Jerzy Maksymuk, and he was amazing because his scores became almost art pieces. He would take big felt pens of orange and pink and purple and things like that, and as you say, you could barely see the notes, but it was very powerful. But I wonder that when, you know, in the heat of the performance, you know, when nerves can play a part and therefore affects maybe your eyesight or whatever it might be, you know, whether these markings actually do become quite helpful in the end.
I've done some pieces where I need it. I've done I did a premiere by, well, I say a premiere by Messiaen, that's a very funny thing to say, a little piece that he wrote, which was never published or orchestrated. And it was incredibly difficult. It had about 200 tempo changes in 4 minutes. And I needed a system of colors because it was so quick to, I guess, just give me very quick visual cues. And I'm very grateful that I did that, because I've managed to get through it, and it's the most stressful thing I've ever done. But the thought of marking up, say, a score of Beethoven's with lots of colors and, you know, whatever stick-in notes, like some people do, that seems almost like blasphemy to me, because there's just a beautiful nakedness about those scores. It's almost like you're putting something on top of the composer, and I don't particularly like that. So little bits of pencil marking to show me the way sometimes.
And it might be that perhaps conductors in 100 or 200, 300 years' time will view the Messiaen score as perhaps similar to a Beethoven score and think,
Exactly.
Oh, how dare you write anything on that score?
Well, by which point they'll all be on their iPads, definitely. I'm sure they will.
They will be. They will be. So how has this whole lockdown period been for you from a creative point of view?
Well, I mean, I've been very, very lucky. I've got 3 small children, and as a conductor, we don't get very much time at home, and that's, you know, one of the great compromises of a conducting career. I'm usually away at least half the year in abroad, and that's really hard with children and a long-suffering wife. So actually, it has been a really wonderful time within the context of, you know, the terrible nature of what it is. It has been a really wonderful time for me to spend with my family, and there's been, you know, it's a very intense environment, and particularly during lockdown it was, but you have to hang on to that. And lots of people who've been very lonely during lockdown, and I feel very much for them, because it you know, it intensifies that loneliness if you are alone, for example. I'd like to see an end to it, certainly. I am feeling a real pull of disturbed creativity. You know, I'm desperate to conduct more than I am. I'm very lucky. Theoretically, tomorrow I should be going to Finland to conduct some concerts there. And I've had some projects in the last couple of months, a BBC Proms and a project in the Netherlands. So I am able to conduct, and I have got, theoretically, again, some projects in the pipeline in the next few months. I'm supposed to be quite busy, but, you know, who knows what will happen to all of them. And that's rather disturbing, because you, as a conductor, it's, I'm sure, the same as a soloist for you, particularly with repertoire coming up, you sort of want to be able to plan when you're learning, what you're learning, how you're preparing for it, and you don't know if all those projects are going to happen or not. It's quite difficult.
It is difficult, and I think it does affect the fluidity of your creativity. I mean, certainly I have found that with the diary having basically evaporated as regards to the concerts, you know, it suddenly completely threw a different emphasis as regards to how you see yourself as a player. You know, you're used to preparing a piece, as you say, for 7:30 on a particular date, and there you have it. But actually not knowing means that there really has to be this impetus to get into your practice room and think, right, what am I going to practice? You know, so what is going to be the most valuable thing to do at this point in time? And in my own case, I found that I suppose this is maybe easier to do being a percussion player, but from the start of lockdown, so each month I'd give myself the challenge of learning a new instrument, or an instrument that I wouldn't ordinarily play. So the first month happened to be the Irish bodhrán. The second month was the Indian kanjira, a little hand drum instrument. The next month it might have been the bones and the spoons. Now all of those things, you know, seem quite fun, but actually it's amazing how it's introduced me to lots of different types of music, and also been aware of how the techniques have evolved from perhaps 30 years ago. And it's also using different muscle groups, you know, within the body. And so I think I've gained a bigger connection with the instruments, perhaps more than music. And I wonder if you have sort of delved into certain types of music that, because you've maybe had the time, although with 3 young children, I probably doubt it, but, you know, something that unexpected perhaps has happened to you.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I wish, you know, at the beginning of lockdown, I thought, well, maybe I'm going to sort of learn Finnish or something. Or, you know,
Yes.
those long-term projects that you always want to do, particularly as a conductor, because unlike you, I suppose we don't have the immediate medium of an instrument that makes a sound. So there are many more diverse things that go into being a conductor. It's not, we don't make a sound, it's more about a wider, you know, cohesive whole of music, I guess. What I have really enjoyed doing, and this has actually just been because I've had the breathing space in terms of learning repertoire to do, is enjoy some of those long-term projects about actual repertoire. And they're things that I have, you know, always wanted to do and find the space. But the problem is, as a conductor, you're quite often learning music on a strict timetable for the next few months, the next years. You know, you have everything plotted out in front of you, often for 2-3 years. And within that space, that diary, you may have only one little slot where you could have any breathing space, because otherwise you have to learn a Mahler symphony, or you have to learn whatever. And these things take a huge amount of time. So what I have actually really enjoyed doing was listening, sitting down with scores to music that I know I want to do conduct at some point, or maybe even not in my life. And I don't know, you know, and there's so much music that partly some of it is our guilty music, you know, that music that as a conductor, I really should have listened to, you know, and it's funny when there's, you see
Give an
other
example.
people. Oh no, it's too embarrassing. I mean, other conductors. Actually, I was pleased to see Simon Rattle said, I think last year on his guilty list was Elijah. I think Mendelssohn's Elijah, a piece he'd never heard before. You know, and it's music like that where you think, well, how have you got through so long without hearing it? And then you think, well, quite easily, because, you know, there's thousands of pieces of music. And okay, I'll give you a few. I mean, where do we start? Okay, to be honest, Mahler's Third Symphony, not a piece I've really ever got to know before. I've conducted one movement of it quite a lot. Various Bruckner symphonies, Sibelius's Fourth Symphony. You know, the list goes on. The music that I've just bypassed for some reason. I didn't actually listen to it yet, but I hardly know the Messiah at all. You know, I've hardly ever listened. I know various choruses from it. Apologies. That's my doorbell.
How lovely.
Handel's Messiah. I hardly know any of it, and that's quite embarrassing, because I was brought up in the British choral tradition, and it's a piece that everybody seems to know and do, and there it is. There's a guilty admission, but.
Well, I remember playing the timpani part to that as a student about 100 times. So
right,
I will say I do know it quite well. But
come on, Evelyn, you must have a guilty. Do you have a guilty secret?
Oh, I'm not sure if I do, because I'm actually a small listener of music, because I appreciate music by seeing it, and so I think possibly I've enjoyed getting into much more ethnic types of music during this whole lockdown period, which you'd expect a percussion player anyway to do, but actually, because my emphasis has been on solo work, it's been trying to get the repertoire, as you well know, and we can talk a little bit about our collaboration with Michael Doherty's Second Percussion Concerto, but I think it's given me a chance to, I think, connect, as I say, with the instruments more. And so this isn't a guilty pleasure, but one of the things I've been trying to do is catalogue all of the instruments in the collection. Wow. And it's allowed me to sort of look at a cajon, for example, you know, box type of drum, wooden drum, and get into a lot of information about it that I hadn't actually realized before. And then look at a lot of players playing it, then different approaches, different tools that are used on it, and all of this kind of thing. So this one instrument might have taken me a whole week or a fortnight or whatever to just catalogue because I've kind of been keen to explore it a bit more. And so from that point of view, I felt like a student again, and it's just been absolutely wonderful. So I guess it's been a really nice distraction from thinking, oh, what should I practice, repertoire wise and so on, because so much of the repertoire that was learnt and prepared for the concerts at the beginning of lockdown were suddenly out of the diary and not being put back in. So you actually find yourself spending weeks and weeks and weeks, months and months and months, preparing something, learning something, and it's just gone, So you've got to get over that hurdle and think positively and not think, oh, well, that was a waste of time or something. Actually really see, well, no, it wasn't a waste of time, because from that you were able to develop X, Y, or Z. So it's like, I haven't answered your question, I realize that.
You're not going to give me Elijah then.
No, but actually, I think, there are, dare I say, quite a lot of percussion repertoire written by percussion players that was really necessary to do at the beginning of exploring solo percussion. But certainly those pieces are definitely, in the dungeons right now, and hopefully wouldn't see the light of day. So I think historically, we're forgiving in some respects, but but yeah, no, it's interesting. But you've got 3 young children, and I know that you started music, at a young age. And is this something that is naturally happening with your own children, where they're exposed to music? And are you finding that they're, in their own natural way beginning to delve into it? Or are they saying, absolutely not at this point, I'm going to be a car mechanic?
I'm not sure they would describe it as a natural process, but they are, yes, by hook or crook, they are certainly within the world of music. Of course, I have no idea how that will pan out in a way. I hope they do something else, but they've all been exposed to it a lot, and it's certainly opened my eyes to the easiness with which children can be exposed to music. Because actually, funnily enough, a lot of my children's exposure was through listening and watching, and it wasn't even to me playing an instrument, or my wife, who's a flute player, playing her instrument. It would be things like watching an orchestra on YouTube, or listening to something on a CD or whatever. No, I love it, because it's sharing music with them, and it's wonderful to see how that develops in them. And yeah, with Zachary, who's the oldest, he's 7. He plays the violin and the piano, and I spend a lot of time with him. Every day we do a bit of both, and again, that's been a wonderful positive of lockdown, because it's a real responsibility, isn't it? Teaching a child an instrument. He's got teachers on both instruments, but I help him with his practice, and it's great fun. Sometimes hard, but mostly great fun.
Absolutely. And you went through the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain as a viola player. I think I'm right in saying that. And of course, now, as we're experiencing and negotiating this whole lockdown period with social distancing and orchestras, or the larger orchestras not necessarily being able to come together in their normal situation. If you can cast your mind back, to being in the NYO, if that had to be socially distanced, or if it had to be smaller, or I wonder, and it's probably impossible to answer this, but how that might have impacted, your whole journey or appreciation of music making.
I would say, again, another reason why I feel lucky is because I am, in my late 30s. I think for the generation of kids and students, university students, people in the NYO, whatever, it's so disruptive and so awful and such a tragedy. I've gone through that period, and I enjoyed those few years in the NYO immensely. And for someone to have ripped well, not someone, but a virus, to have ripped away 2-3 courses from those very intense years. It's a tragedy. It really is. And to see students going to university and missing out on whole terms of education, maybe more, it's I can't put it into words. And actually we're very lucky being at a more advanced stage where in some ways it matters less. I mean, it matters for other reasons, but so I think we need to do everything we can to make it up to that generation, actually. And of course all organizations are doing all they can, and now young people are so good at being connected on social media, and they find ways, don't they? But nothing replaces being together, social contact, and live music making in our field, and it's very sad.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I wonder that you started, or maybe I should clarify, because when you were a member of the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain, I mean, had you imagined forming your own orchestra at that time, at that age? Was something bubbling in your mind
Nope.
as you were playing there, or no? So you had you the vision of being a conductor even, or?
Absolutely, yeah. From the age of quite young, so probably 10, 11. Conducting was certainly a thing, but no, I never thought about forming an orchestra. And to be honest, it was more the idea of my colleague, well, in fact, he was in the NYO with me then, Robin Ticciati, who's another conductor who went to the same college at Cambridge. And it was more his idea to actually form Aurora. So we ended up doing it together when we left Cambridge. And then he left Aurora after a couple of years, 2006. So it became my baby on my own. But no, it was a sudden sort of impulse upon leaving the security of a music degree at university, and thank goodness it happened. It was a wonderful new adventure.
Incredible. And at the time, why did yourself and Robin feel that there was a need for another orchestra? Britain has got so many orchestras and chamber orchestras and various groups of one sort or another. So why another? What did you think was needed? Why would this be different?
Well, funnily enough, when we started it in 2004, I feel as if there had been another spate of groups in the 1960s and 70s. And actually not so many institutions had grown up in the previous 10, 20 years. Since we started, there have been an awful lot, actually. There's a lot of new groups around. But it felt like there was a need for something new and fresh. And our particular generation of players from the NYO and university and Royal Academy and Royal College, they were really, really special, actually. There were some very special solo players. And we just thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to put on some concerts and see what happens? And it didn't really have particularly grand aspirations or a sort of very clear raison d'etre. We just knew we wanted to put on music. It was very, well, it's quite arrogant in a way, I guess. It was just the thought of, let's put on a concert and people will turn up, I'm sure.
But I think that's really interesting because, as you say, it is almost an arrogant attitude that's needed in order to deal with not just the musical aspects, but everything else that goes along with that, because it's an enormous learning curve. It really is. But when the spirit of the players all come together and they're all absolutely hungry for something different, it becomes just an extraordinary kind of fireball then. But with the idea of for example, standing up to play, I mean, there are one or two other ensembles, smaller ensembles who do that. I mean, I've worked a lot with Robin's brother, Hugo, and with his wonderful string quartet and string orchestra, O Mordaunt. And it's incredible that the energy when players stand, it's a very different kind of presence to the music. Did you start off by asking the players to stand, or was this just something that evolved, or do you mix the situation depending on the repertoire?
Standing up came along with memorizing. which was something we first did in 2014 as part of the BBC Proms. And that felt like a natural part of the presentation of a memorized piece. And that constitutes, I don't know, less than 50% of our activity. So we still sit a lot, and we still play with sheet music a lot. And the work that we do is quite diverse, and some of it will be complicated contemporary music, and we won't go near memorizing it. But I certainly feel when we do play from memory and the players are standing up, it's a completely different vibe within the group. It's a different communication with the audience and with ourselves as well. And I love it. And actually quite a few groups now stand up as well. I mean, it certainly wasn't us that did it, for the first time. Quite a few period instrument groups do it. And I think people appreciate the difference actually that it makes, and the vitality that you feel, and players usually love it. I've done it with a few more, shall I say, traditional symphony orchestras who had never stood up before.
I was going to ask that actually.
And a couple of them have needed sort of union meetings and various year-long discussions and conferences to decide whether it's acceptable, because it is a big deal. And people, with a young group, you remember, of course, that people perhaps find it less tiring. It's occasionally a tiring thing to rehearse and to perform like that. As a conductor, I sometimes feel standing up, oh, God, you get to the end of an hour and a half long symphony and you're quite happy to sit down. That's a really interesting thing. I've done it with a few, more traditional symphony orchestras, and the players, they're nearly unanimously, not unanimously, but nearly have said, that's incredible, the difference. It makes you feel, well, younger, apart from anything else. It makes you feel like a totally different being.
I think it's so interesting that you say that, because what I find watching the musicians standing is that you can see the power of the whole body in the sound. You really can, and there seems to be this united kind of force because people have the freedom to move that whole body. And again, from a visual aspect, you feel almost as though the instrument is an extension of their limbs rather than having the chair as part of that, setup, really. It's a very odd thing, and it's hard to describe, but it definitely seems to influence the giving of the sound. It really does. It's just a different energy.
I mean, the interesting thing for you, of course, is that you're the one instrument in the symphony orchestra that does stand up.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. Not as a timpanist, perhaps, although some do. But what I love, actually, when I look at orchestral percussionists, particularly percussionists, I think, is it must be part of your training to stand really well. And because you do it all the time, they generally, on the whole, look good when they stand, because they understand about the need of, as you say, if you're going to do a cymbal crash, and that's basically all you're going to do for an hour and a half, you have to have the ability to put all your body and your physicality into it. And as a violinist, you often practice standing up at home, but then you sit down for 6 hours and you're squashed into a box. And I think that's really... it does limit you. It's very interesting when we play from memory or standing up, that the general sound of the orchestra is much bigger. And I actually have to spend quite a bit of time suppressing that so that we find the balance. You tell a violinist to stand up, they think that they're Yehudi Menuhin, suddenly, and they play like that, as if they're playing a Brahms concerto. You say, well, all you're doing is playing a single note here. Can you be part of the first violin section instead? And you have to sort of completely find a new balance with it.
And I suppose acoustically as well. I mean, I know it sounds perhaps ridiculous, and I'm not saying this is or isn't the case. It's just to throw out there where, if you have a violinist, for example, sitting down to play, and then they stand up, so they're perhaps 1.5 feet, 2 feet higher, the sound is suddenly higher in the atmosphere, as it were. So probably that might, have an influence on the dynamic of the sound as well. Who
Oh,
knows?
hugely, and possibly the sound is less compact as well. You know, symphony orchestra is a
Yeah.
huge beast, so they work towards compactness. So the sound wants to sort of somehow meld together, and when you have everyone standing up, you then get a more diverse sound range. And again, what I work on is drawing the sound back to a central point together. So it is different.
So with the memorization, I mean, how does this work in reality with the whole learning process? I mean, are the players going off and listening to their parts as well as to the whole score for months on end, or do you have extra rehearsals together? I mean, what's the mechanics of all of this?
So they go off and rehearse, they learn their individual part before the first rehearsal, because trying to memorize as a group is completely ineffectual. They basically have to come knowing their part. Occasionally you find the odd one who perhaps doesn't, but on the whole, they turn up and they know 90% of the part. And then it's about fine-tuning that. And during the rehearsal process, which is pretty standard in length, we don't do much more rehearsal than a normal European orchestra, let's say. Not a British one, but let's say we do 2 or 3 days of rehearsal. I never talk about memorization. We just talk about musical rehearsal. So it's never covering anything in order to make that better for memory. That's their job. We don't discuss it. It's not interesting. What's interesting is the time that we have together to work on the music, and people respond to that. And that is, I guess that's one of the major points of the process, that they've put so much time into it and of their own energy. They also feel that there is the point in spending 10, 12 hours on a Beethoven symphony, picking it apart, listening, trying out ideas in a way that's harder, not impossible, but harder to achieve in a just a normal process. And that for me is the defining reason why we do it, actually, is the musicality, the depth of understanding that they will go into. And it's just more profound, I think, for us as players than it would be during a normal process.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Have there been any mishaps at all in concerts where suddenly there has been a memory lapse somewhere in there? Well, whoa, so you're shaking your head. That's incredible.
No, this is the
That's amazing.
I think if you ask people, they'd probably say, oh gosh, I played an A natural there instead. But I mean, in comparison to the standard mishaps that you will get anyway.
Exactly.
But I remember that.
That's amazing.
Well, in a way, it's not, because the clarinetist said to me when we did Beethoven 5, he said, I've played the first movement of Beethoven 5 50 times. And every time I play it, I'm a little bit stressed about counting where to come in, because it's quite a tricky movement, actually, to play in the right place, believe it or not. And he said, and I usually might do something a little bit wonky. Well, now I've memorized it, I never will, because it's there.
How interesting. And do you think that you may ask the symphony orchestras to try this, or have you already to try memorizing? Or is that another year-long discussion?
No, I think no is the basic answer to that. I mean, the problem with asking orchestras with fixed members is that they don't really get an option to say no. And I think people need an option to say no to this. It's a huge investment of time. And people do the Aurora projects because they're given the choice to accept it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. You're just about to start as the principal conductor of the Finnish Radio Orchestra, which is a major post, and lots of congratulations for that, because of course there's just such an incredible legacy and appreciation of Finnish music, Finnish composers, musicians, audiences, of course. And Are you finding, because you also conduct in so many other parts of the world and have residencies and you're chief conductors and principal conductors with several orchestras, but are you finding different voices, different sounds from these orchestras? Because one of the things that seems to be quite prevalent at the moment is how, as you say, we can all experience music digitally. We can go on YouTube and we can see things, or we can buy a CD, or all sorts of things like that. And are you finding that orchestras are keeping their identity, their sound identity, or is this something that is becoming more generic? I don't know how your views are, because you're still a very young conductor in the scheme of things and venturing into places that are still relatively new. I just wonder what your take is of that.
Well, look, every orchestra has its unique sound. And although I try to avoid stereotypes about cultures or identities or nationalities, it is fair to say that all the Finnish orchestras, all the Scandinavian orchestras are quite different in sound and personality from, say, a German orchestra. There's partly the repertoire they play, but it is something about their characteristics as well. And that is fairly obvious. So, for example, with Finnish Radio, who are a wonderful orchestra, and I'm extremely excited and very lucky about taking this job on. Rehearsals with them are incredibly efficient. They are very focused, very quiet. They don't talk very much, which as a conductor is an enormous blessing, actually. So you will often find, particularly as a young conductor, that one of your chief jobs is acting as a sort of school teacher, trying to quieten the noisy students, and there are we all have had as conductors experiences where you feel that you've lost that battle and you've lost the attention of an orchestra. I don't think that there's ever the case really with an orchestra like the Finnish Radio where anyone would feel that, even if it doesn't go very well, and that's an amazing thing, and they eat up contemporary music. That's absolutely their bread and butter. In a similar way to British orchestras, they have a similar ability to sight read, to play rhythmically, to play as an ensemble. But the interesting thing, of course, is when you talk about these sort of sounds or national characteristics, or whatever that individuality might be, it's obviously the case over the last 100 years that we have more fluidity, as we do with migration between countries, So, for example, in Finland, there's now a lot of players who are not Finnish themselves, who are not Finnish speakers. I expect that 60 years ago, that was very different. And that brings with it different styles of playing, different styles of orchestral experience. So the same in the UK, we have orchestras here with huge amounts of European players and foreign players, and that is just a wonderful thing, isn't it? And I'm very pro the sharing of ideas generally. I think we all get a huge amount out of that, and that's why, from my selfish point of view, although I'd love conducting British orchestras, I also get a huge amount out of going abroad, because actually I think I can share with them in a very different way. They treat me differently. As a British conductor with a British orchestra, there's a certain stigma, there's a certain relationship. But when I go to a foreign orchestra, it's completely different. And I can share differently, and they can share with me differently as well. And I'm in Finland, I'm going to be the first principal conductor there who's not Finnish. That's a very interesting thing for them. Whether it becomes a terrible thing or a good thing, I don't know. But it will be different for them to have someone who is not from their own language and from their own culture in front of them, on a very regular basis. So I think it's such a cliche, isn't it? We all know that music is a universal language, and that it's the one thing that we can all speak together, and that is a an incredible thing to be able to share actually with people, and it's part of my job that I love.
Absolutely. And there seems to be such a wonderful pool of young conductors, throughout the world, really. And I don't know if this is just coincidence, or if we're just suddenly noticing this, or if we're, really embracing this sort of youthful energy whereby many musicians have been brought up with such a diverse range of repertoire, and not afraid to think about different types of music. And so the categorizations are not the most important thing. It's just, well, music is music, and interesting artists are interesting artists, full stop. Is that something that you feel? Because obviously with the Aurora Orchestra, I mean, the connection with so many art forms, it has been so prevalent in so many of your performances, and therefore the outreach has been absolutely fantastic.
Oh, it certainly is. And I think everyone in music has a wider perspective than they did perhaps 100 years ago. As a conductor, there was a certain model that you were supposed to be, probably white, male, and you were probably supposed to go through a German Kapellmeister route, or, play for as an opera repetiteur. And thank God that has changed. And people like Simon Rattle showed that you could be a young conductor. And then we've had people showing that you could be a woman conductor and that you can be a black conductor. And this is so obvious, but people have needed to break the molds on that. And along with that, you get, of course, people from all around the world who have really interesting and diverse musical loves and traditions and ways of approaching music. It may not even be that they have a different knowledge of, say, a different type of music, but it just may be that they have an interesting take on music or how to present music. And there's so many conductors that I look at now, I don't know, people like Theodore Karensis, who's got an incredibly idiosyncratic view of music making and how it should go, and how you can present it. And you don't have to love it, you don't have to hate it, whatever. It is unique, and it's not unique for the sake of being unique. It is just unique, and that is so valuable for the growth of music. And we have to keep, as a system, we have to keep developing and expanding and pushing at the box, and not just for the sake of what people say of attracting audiences. I'm not particularly worried about that, but for the sake of life, for this art form to grow, it has to do that. That's of course connected with contemporary music, pushing as much as possible on the future of music, as opposed to just looking at the canon, which is so dear and beloved to all of us. But people are thinking a lot more about these issues than they were, I guess, 50 years ago.
And do you think that this whole lockdown situation has perhaps pushed the orchestral scene into thinking, rethinking, reevaluating, analysing their situation, their audiences, the repertoire they play, how they put things on? Do you think that this has been a bit of a nudge to think, well, what are we? What do we provide, to society, to our communities, and so on? I just wonder if this actually is an opportunity, with all the doom and gloom that we relate COVID to, but actually there's always a yin and yang to everything, or I certainly believe that, and I wonder whether this is an opportunity, not just for orchestras, but for lots of different industries and different parts of industries. But I'm somehow excited about how orchestras will explore other avenues and veins and paths and so on.
It's a very interesting question, and we talk about it actually with the Aurora team. To what extent will there be long-lasting change, or perhaps, let's say we get a vaccine, we come out of this next summer, will everything just flick back to normal, with the exception of probably an economic recession, the likes of which we've not seen before? Who knows? It's a really interesting question. It's certainly, from my point of view, it's asked me, the virus has asked of me lots and lots of questions about, personally, what music do I want to be doing and how do I deliver it? With Aurora, what is our reason for being here? And I think for lots of, for example, orchestras, certain questions around localization versus internationalization, which is a really vital one, particularly with climate change, traveling, this old concept of international touring and orchestras flying off to play the Brahms Second Symphony in Asia with a famous conductor, and then the Asian orchestra comes over here to play Brahms Second Symphony with their famous conductor, you know, and you think, well, what's the point of that? All you've managed there is to release 7 megatons of CO2 into the air, you know, that kind of thing, versus what has shown up a little bit during, say, lockdown, which is a nice idea. I don't know whether people will capitalize upon it, but the localization. So, you know, people connecting more with, what do people need in my community? Is it playing music in care homes around where I am? Is it, you know, giving concerts that are outdoor to the community because that's their way of accessing? And so thinking more on a community basis, because lockdown has forced us to. Whether that has long-lasting change, I don't know, but I think it's certainly asked a lot of questions, and you'll see a huge amount of change. You know, for example, the big Arts Council Emergency Fund that has just come through, a lot of the organisations have been awarded money, a lot of which will go towards big digital initiatives, streaming concerts, accessibility to digital content. Now, that's a really interesting question. And again, I ask a lot of questions of myself about that. What's the value of creating a product that is sort of filmed but looks like a traditional concert, when perhaps you should be creating something that's more specifically created for digital online content that has a little more around it, or another way of accessing? I don't know. All those questions are very, very interesting and pertinent ones, but certainly it's unlocked a whole discussion around digital content, which is very important for music.
It is hugely important, and hugely important for the youngsters, whereby technology is, you know, like an extension of their limbs, really, and the beating of their heart almost. So it is interesting. My personal view on this is that digital art in general will become a specialized, it will become its own art form. And I don't think it will be enough simply to film a concert and then put that out on YouTube or whatever. I don't think that's enough for people to gain the emotional long-term pull of wanting to follow something. So, I mean, there's all sorts of things, but I think it's a very interesting time, and time will be the aspect that we need in order to see how things follow through. So it's really interesting to get your thoughts on that. So we collaborated, Nick, was it 3 years? I'm terrible with dates. 3 years ago, 4 years ago? Oh, I can't remember.
Actually, I can remember. It was because my son had just been born, so it was 4 years ago.
4 years ago. And we played Dream Machine by Michael Dougherty, the American composer, and this was his second percussion concerto. Had you conducted a percussion concerto before? Seemed as though you had, because you just did it so splendidly, but whether you had...
I must have done, but I can't even think. I'm sure. Yes, I've done stuff. I've done quite a lot of repertoire with Colin Curry, actually.
Oh, yes.
We've done a big recording with the Halle of various pieces.
Oh, brilliant.
But I'm sure I've done quite a few things, yeah.
Fantastic, yeah. So how was it to have this barrage of instruments at the front of the platform, you know, as opposed to a more familiar violin or piano or voice or trumpet even? You know, does this affect your listening skills as regards to balance, to working out where the sounds are coming from. I mean, I remember, years ago when percussion concertos were quite new, and conductors would look at the score, obviously, and follow the rhythm of the solo percussion, but not the sound color. And which is quite interesting, but the more experienced conductors have become and the more repertoire that's been written, they are understanding much, much more about, if they see a symbol written on the score and a wood block, that those are two completely different sound colors, and therefore they have to be dealt with quite differently, So do you find that conducting a percussion soloist is quite different to conducting a violinist or something?
No, I guess.
Oh, okay. I shouldn't have asked a yes or no question. There we go.
You're going to get a yes or no answer. No, because essentially all it is, I mean, it's obviously a more diverse range of sounds than the violinist could ever hope to produce. But essentially what it is notes turned into sound, and how they communicate with the diverse group of instruments that I have in front of me, which in many ways can match in diversity what you could do, because for example, in the Doherty piece, it's a big orchestra, so you have everything. You have strings and wind and brass, and I think there's even some orchestral percussion, isn't there? Is that right? No, I absolutely adore percussion. I found it fascinating. I like the concept of someone taking so much care over essentially, the acoustic properties of what these pieces of wood or metal, whatever they are, can achieve. And that's sort of what I'm doing in my job as a conductor. I don't hit anything, but what I'm trying to do is carve out sound from the air and show them a way. In many ways, it's not a dissimilar gestural technique from what you learn as percussionists. I would say conducting is the most similar gestural technique to percussion. So if you watch a timpanist play just a single note on a timpani, it's got a very similar trajectory of speed as to a conductor giving a downbeat, or an upbeat before downbeat, I should say. And that's what you learn as a conductor, this thing of needing to speed through a beat. So there's a clear sort of click point where the fastest point of the beat is. Now that point on a timpani is where you then strike the instrument. But it's a thing of beauty to watch. So watching a percussionist is a thing of beauty, as you know. Seeing them hit an instrument is a very similar trajectory. So shaping that and following that of a percussionist is I always find it visually and audibly fascinating. And I love doing it because you have such a wide palette of sounds that we're pushed to try and match that with the orchestra.
Do you think, or have you ever thought about learning sign language in order to think about the placement of movement within air and how they place tenses and how they emphasize dynamics through the use of sign language? Is that something you've ever considered?
That is fascinating. Well, to be honest, it's something I know shamefully little about and would be very interested to learn more. But the concept of creating dynamics through movement is a really interesting phenomenon, isn't it? That you can do that so easily within sign language. But as I say, it's not something that I am well versed in.
You could learn as a family. There's something for the kids.
It's a very important idea.
Oh, Nick. Well, look, I realize that I've taken up a lot of your time because we had a slight hiccup at the beginning of this where I somehow had failed to manage to connect with you, and you very kindly saved the day, which I very much appreciate, but it did eat into a little bit of time. But I'm going to ask one last question, Nick. If you could be stranded on a desert island, which piece of music or what sound would you like there with you?
Oh, wow. Right, I didn't know I was going to get that. You know what? I think it might be a sound. because a piece of music, however much I love it, after a while would start to grate and I'd feel nostalgic and sad. There is a specific sound that I equate with a baby, and it's really interesting. With all our 3 children, we're desperate to get them to sleep. We've used, as lots of parents seem to, a thing called white noise, you know, which is, well, manifests itself in lots of different types of sort of background noise, and that's supposed to make your baby sleep better. So you try anything, don't you? And
How
there's
lovely.
a particular white noise app that we use, and we've always used a sound called Mountain River. So when we've had our babies in our rooms, I've had to get used to sleeping with the sound of a mountain river. And at the beginning, the first few weeks of a baby, I'm always like, oh my God, can you turn that mountain river off? And by the end of it, after a few months, and when the baby leaves the room, I've been unable to sleep because I've missed the mountain river. And the funny thing was, we went for a walk in the Lake District with our family when was it, in August. And we took our baby out in the sling on the walk, and she was crying a bit, and I thought she's probably sleepy and blah, blah, blah. We walked a bit onwards. And then do you know what we came across? An actual mountain river. And it sounded exactly like a mountain river. And it went, and we had to walk along the banks of the mountain river. Within 30 seconds, she was asleep.
How
it was
brilliant.
Astonishing, and it was absolutely that did it. She just knew that was her cue, and she went to sleep. So I'm sure I would sit on my desert island and have a good sleep at that point, which is what you want, isn't it?
Well, we're all listening to nature more profoundly at the moment, so I think it's a lovely thing to have on a desert island, and maybe we can all just put it in our own homes and relax a little bit more and get a bit sleepy there. Nick, thank you so much indeed. We really, appreciate everything, and for you giving us your time like this. And it's been really fascinating, and I just wish you all the very best in your family, and certainly with your new post in Finland. So that's really, really exciting. And of course, all the fantastic things that Aurora are up to. I just think it's one of the absolute gems that we have in this country, in order to give us all the excitement that we need through the exploration of all kinds of repertoire. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for your kind words, and lovely to see you again.
Thank you, Nick.